The Stanford Prison Experiment. Conducted by psychologist Philip Zimbardo in 1971, the Stanford Prison Experiment aimed to study the psychological effects of power dynamics and social roles. Zimbardo and his team recruited 24 male college students to play the roles of prisoners and guards in a simulated prison environment. However, the experiment quickly spiraled out of control as the guards began to exhibit abusive and sadistic behavior towards the prisoners. Zimbardo had to terminate the experiment after just 6 days, as the situation had become too dangerous and damaging for the participants. The Milgram Experiment. Conducted by psychologist Stanley Milgram in 1961, the Milgram Experiment aimed to study people's obedience to authority figures. The experiment involved a teacher who was instructed to administer electric shocks to a learner every time they made a mistake on a memory test. The shocks were fake, but the teacher believed they were real. Despite the learner's cries of pain and pleas for mercy, over 60% of the teachers continued to administer shocks up to the highest voltage level, as instructed by the experimenter. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment. Conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service between 1932 and 1972, the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment aimed to study the natural progression of untreated syphilis in African American men. However, the study was deeply unethical, as the participants were not informed of their diagnosis, nor were they given the appropriate treatment when it became available. As a result, many of the participants suffered from serious health complications and some died as a direct result of the experiment. The Monster Study. Conducted by Wendell Johnson in 1939, the Monster Study aimed to investigate the causes of stuttering in children. Johnson selected 22 orphan children and divided them into 2 groups. One group received positive speech therapy, while the other group was subjected to negative therapy that criticized their speech and told them they were stutterers. The negative therapy had lasting psychological effects on the children, causing many of them to develop speech problems and low self-esteem. The Bystander Effect. In 1964, psychologists Bibb Latané and John Darley conducted a series of experiments to study the bystander effect, which refers to the phenomenon where people are less likely to intervene in an emergency situation when others are present. In one experiment, participants were placed in a room and told to complete a survey, while smoke began to fill the room through a vent. When participants were alone, they quickly left the room to report the smoke. However, when there were other participants in the room who did not react to the smoke, the individual participants took much longer to report the emergency. The Marshmallow Test. Conducted by psychologist Walter Mischel in the 1960s, the marshmallow test aimed to study children's ability to delay gratification. The experiment involved placing a marshmallow in front of a child and telling them they could have a second marshmallow if they could resist eating the first one for 15 minutes. The study found that children who were able to delay gratification had better life outcomes in terms of academic achievement, social skills, and overall success. The Rat Park Experiment. Conducted by psychologist Bruce Alexander in the 1970s, the Rat Park Experiment aimed to challenge the prevailing view of addiction, which focused on the biological effects of drugs. Alexander housed rats in 2 different environments, one with access to drugs and one with access to other rats and stimulating activities. The rats in the enriched environment were much less likely to become addicted to drugs than the rats in the isolated environment, suggesting that social and environmental factors play a significant role in addiction. The Sleep Deprivation Experiment. Conducted by psychologist Peter Tripp in 1959, the Sleep Deprivation Experiment aimed to study the effects of extreme sleep deprivation on a human subject. Tripp stayed awake for 201 hours, over 8 days, and was monitored for physical, emotional, and cognitive changes. He experienced hallucinations, paranoia, and emotional instability, as well as physical symptoms such as speech impairment and tremors. The experiment demonstrated the critical importance of sleep for human health and functioning. The Conformity Experiment. Conducted by psychologist Solomon Asch in the 1950s, the Conformity Experiment aimed to study the power of social pressure to influence individual behavior. In the experiment, participants were shown a series of lines of different lengths and asked to identify which line was the same length as a reference line. However, the other participants in the room, who were actually confederates of the experimenter, gave intentionally incorrect answers. The study found that participants were willing to conform to the incorrect answers given by the majority of the group, even when it was clear that they were wrong. The Bobo Doll Experiment. Conducted by psychologist Albert Bandura in 1961, the Bobo doll experiment aimed to study the relationship between exposure to aggression and violent behavior in children. In the experiment, children watched a video of an adult model aggressively attacking a Bobo doll. Later, the children were given the opportunity to play with the same Bobo doll and were observed for their behavior. The study found that children who had watched the aggressive model were more likely to imitate the behavior and exhibit aggressive behavior towards the doll. The experiment had significant implications for understanding the role of media and exposure to violence in children's behavior. Please consider subscribing, it helps us in our work. Thanks for watching.